of an era and standing at the brink of a new one. Welcome, everyone, to another Singularity Syndicate podcast. I'm your host, Naja Faisal. And in our community, we discuss transformative technologies and its implication on our collective future. I recently stumbled upon a fascinating idea in a book I'm listening to that suggested that when an era ends, nobody really rings a bell. For example, when the Roman Empire ended, the next ruler assumed position, and life goes on long enough until people look back and realize the monumental shift, the end of that era. Today, we're having Dr. Thomas Corrigan at the show, and we're going to chat about whether we are living in such a transformation defined by artificial intelligence and especially its impact on media, society, and democracy. Dr. Corrigan is a professor at Cal State San Bernardino and he has a PhD in communication studies. Welcome, Doctor, to the program. And if you can tell us more a little bit about yourself and your areas of research.
Great. Well, thanks so much for having me, Naja. It's a pleasure to be on your program. I've caught a few of your previous conversations, and I'm looking forward to engaging you around these topics. So yeah, my name is Thomas Corrigan, or I go by TC. I'm a professor in the Department of Communication Studies at California State University, San Bernardino, and my research and teaching interests are around media studies, particularly the political economy of communication. Political economy of communication is concerned with wealth, power, and the media, but it's particularly interested in the implications of commercial media and capitalism for democracy. And so that's sort of the broader framework of interest areas that has me interested in and looking into artificial intelligence as a new, but as we'll talk about today, it has antecedents in previous technologies that I think are really important for making sense of what this thing is, right, and what its implications are for the future, who benefits from it, right, and how we can create a more just and democratic society, and whether the current artificial intelligence sort of structures and companies are the path to that future. So.
You know, it's exciting, Doctor, because I think you were one of my early supporters as soon as I started a podcast about AI earlier in 2023 at the amidst the launch of ChatGPT, and you were such a great support, and I think you realized what I realized, and we kind of had a match of the minds of the impact of such technology. And a lot of people are walking by and continue living normal despite the transformative nature of what we believe like is AI. And at the beginning, when we discussed this podcast, we talked about having a title that involves critical junctures. But I find that probably we need to simplify it more for the general audience. But your research in critical junctures. So can you define like what are the critical junctures and how are they related to artificial intelligence?
Yeah. So critical junctures, and this is a framework. I by no means developed this framework. Really, the key thinkers in communication studies. The idea originally comes out of historical institutionalism, which is a framework that's prominent in the social sciences, useful for studying technology studies, the development of political institutions. In media and communication studies, it's most closely associated with folks like Robert McChesney and Victor Picard, who are media and communication theorists and researchers. And I think maybe the best place to start, if you don't mind me doing a little bit of reading,
Please.
is to share a little excerpt from Robert McChesney from his book digital disconnect. And I think it's a really nice, tight, and clear summary of what critical junctures are. And I want to then sort of transition to thinking about, how can this be useful for thinking about artificial intelligence and the wider digital revolution? So McChesney says that the idea of critical junctures helps explain how social change works. There are rare, brief periods in which dramatic changes are debated and enacted, drawing from a broad palette of options, followed by long periods in which structural or institutional change is slow and difficult. Now, you might be more familiar, if you've never heard of critical junctures before, the concept of path dependency might be more familiar. So path dependency is sort of this idea that in technological systems and institutional structures, there can be this sort of reinforcing feedback loops created that create inertia so that the ways that we do things end up getting reinforced over time. My favorite example in communication studies is the commercial broadcast system from the 1930s on through most of the 20th century, dominated by a handful of broadcast networks, right? ABC, NBC, CBS in the U.S. And that system, it wasn't natural. It's not divinely handed down to us, right?
Mhm.
But it became so ingrained into the day-to-day lives and into the wider economy, right, in terms of advertising and monopoly capitalism, that the idea that we might have a different form of commercial broadcast system was largely unthinkable, right? Um, but it was created, right? There were
Mhm.
policies, there were technologies developed, there were power plays within the marketplace that created that system. And those moments when those changes are enacted, when you move from a very early broadcast system, which was very freewheeling, right? The very early days of broadcasting were freewheeling with unions running their own broadcast stations, with churches, with educators, with just everyday folks broadcasting essentially out of their garages, right? And it transformed from that to this industrial behemoth, right?
Mm.
And those critical junctures, when policies are implemented, for instance, the 1934 Communication Act, which created this structure, right, this commercial broadcast structure, those sorts of moments are what we refer to as critical junctures. And I like to think of it as sort of the flip side of path dependency, right?
Mm.
Once a critical juncture is in place, or sorry, a critical juncture unfolds and path dependent processes start to take over, then it's hard to not only undo those, but it's hard to imagine something different, right?
Mm.
And so, when I think about, actually, let me continue on a little bit from McChesney. He says that during a critical juncture, which usually lasts no more than 1 or 2 decades, the range of options for society is much greater than it is otherwise.
Mm.
Ideas that were once verboten or unthinkable are suddenly on the table. The decisions made during such a period establish institutions and rules that put society on a course that will be difficult to change for decades or generations, right? And so that's the path dependency side of it, right? You've got this moment where there's a chance to think big, right? To do new things, in part because you have to, right? There's some sort of crisis that unfolds. And those choices made during that period, sometimes democratically, sometimes behind closed doors, right, have these really profound implications that can last for decades, right? A critical juncture creates AT&T as the dominant monopoly in telecommunications. And it is the dominant monopoly for 8 decades, right?
Right.
A critical juncture creates the commercial broadcast structure, and ABC, NBC, and CBS become the dominant broadcasters for the rest of the 20th century, right? And so, it's important to ask ourselves, with these new technological developments, right, what are the choices we're making today that are going to have those sorts of implications for decades to come, right? And is that decision making process a democratic one that has pro social benefits? Or is it
Mm.
something that's unfolding behind closed doors in a way that's going to benefit the already powerful institutions that are developing these systems?
That's fascinating. But I want to, before asking you if we are living in one,
Mhm.
I want to like go back because here at this podcast, we always discuss, if you remember, even in the early days of the program, we were discussing, for example, the history of technological revolution. Like, for example, the fire, right? Like, fire came to the human race, and it fundamentally changed everything in our diet. It allows us to consume large amount of calories, which is biologically even transformed our brain like biologically impacts our development and our evolution. And then comes language, right? Are we the and then, like, the agricultural age and all of this stuff, are these also called, could be called critical junctures? However, they are not in the media department. And the next question, that's kind of a follow-up with this one: when it comes to critical junctions in terms of media, society, and democracy, like, what are the main ones? You mentioned cable television. Could newspaper be one? And how this historically goes back, and what are the main critical junctures in history in your
Yeah.
view?
So let me start with, you were asking, are we talking about something like fire, right, or speech? And in McChesney's work, he distinguishes those something like speech. He classifies as a transformative technology, right, or
Mm,
a transformative capacity. And he also includes the printing press as a clearly transformative technology, electronic broadcast media, right,
mhm,
or electronic media more generally, right. So the sort of the collection of technologies around the late 1800s, early 1900s, moving pictures, broadcasting, telecommunications, etc., as itself its own transformative communication and media moment. And he says that we're likely living through a fourth moment in communication and media, and that being the digital revolution, right?
mm,
And so I think one way to start to make sense of artificial intelligence is not to focus so much on AI specifically. It's clearly, it has the potential to be a really profound technology, right?
mm,
But it's part of a much larger collection of digital technologies. The networked computing, right? Uh,
mm.
the AI cannot happen without it, right?
Yeah.
Uh,
Okay.
the web, right? Smartphones, right? The fact that we have had smartphones, on our person, right,
Right.
for more than a decade now, has allowed folks to create the speech, right, the images, the text that is now being gathered by these digital giants to produce artificial intelligence, right? You can't have these, the current development without that larger sort of constellation of digital technologies, social media as well. Not that these companies are, at least as far as I understand it, scraping social media to produce AI outputs. But you wouldn't have Facebook, for instance, or Google, right, in position to do what they do were it not for the revenue generated from those other industries that they are so dominant in, search and social media, for instance, Amazon and e-commerce, right? And so, artificial intelligence, clearly it's got this, transformative potential, but I think it's much, it makes more sense to understand it in the larger scope of the digital revolution as one potentially quite important component in
Mm.
that larger social transformation. If that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's great. But I have a question as well. Critical juncture and transformative technologies are like, how they differ.
Yeah. So McChesney's got this line where he says, we've got these critical junctures around individual technologies, but he also says that the digital revolution is kind of the mother of all critical junctures,
Mm,
right?
mm,
And
mm.
so, I sort of look at social transformations, associated with major media developments, right? Speech, the printing
Mm.
press, electronic media, the internet, et cetera, as sort of, critical junctures on steroids, right?
Right.
They are the moments when, you can look at, and critical junctures, they can be on a much smaller scale. So one of the classic classic examples of path dependency is the QWERTY keyboard, right? So the QWERTY keyboard is
Mm,
this, standard keyboard setup, but it's actually not the most efficient keyboard setup. There are
mm,
other keyboard setups that are more efficient than QWERTY. It was actually developed to be inefficient so that the keys wouldn't jam on early typewriters, right? And
mm,
so we have this inefficient keyboard setup, right, that was designed to be inefficient, but it is our standard, right, our industry standard for computers. And the function of that was a series of critical juncture moments that produced that as the standard rather than other options that were being developed at the time, right? And so critical junctures is sort of this flexible concept that can be used for keyboards. It can be used for the development of, individual communication technologies. It can also be used to make sense of big picture transformations. It's been used to make sense of, for instance, the formation of the European Union, right?
mm.
And that sort of path dependent series of relationships, right, that were hard to untangle for several decades until Great Britain started to untangle that right through
Got it.
through
Yeah.
uh, through Brexit. So, anyways, yeah. So that's sort of how I make sense of critical junctures as a way to make sense of changes at a couple different levels of analysis.
Got it.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. So you think that we are now living in a critical juncture and not in a transformative technology. And the people opposing that view would argue that no, now, I mean, in the digital revolution, we were explicitly programming machines to do very predicted tasks, expected tasks, where machines did not provide any new ideas, any intelligence. They weren't able to reason language and understand language. And as you know, that language is a transformative technology, and at the moment, language encompasses most of our human intelligence. So people who argue that no, AI is a transformative technology argue on the basis that because it is a generative technology, because it has a way to like reason and output and obviously passes the Turing test. They argue that it is a transformative technology. So are we living in a critical juncture right now? And how likely it is that this critical juncture become a transformative technology in the future?
Yeah. So I would not argue that I wouldn't say that we're not living through a transformative moment. I hope I didn't give that impression. I just think that AI is part of a larger transformation, right? Now, what you were saying there was that there are characteristics of AI itself, right, that might be that themselves transformative. And I think that's to me that's a hard thing to say when you're in the moment, right, of the juncture, right. For instance, if we think about the printing press, right, as as in the early decades of the printing press being implemented, the the implications of it, right, longer term in terms of democracy, in terms of the scientific revolution, in terms of the industrial revolution, globalization, et cetera. Those things were, unimaginable, right? In part because there wasn't the language, right, in terms of literacy in the early days of the rollout of the printing press, to be able to make sense of where this thing was going, right? And so, I would not, by any means, consider myself or anybody else, right, in a position to make the claim that we are or are not in a transformative, that this is or is not a transformative technology, because I don't think we have that hindsight, right? We don't have the benefit of hindsight to be able to talk about the ways in which it is or is not, right? I think that it's a I think one of the things that I'm a little that was seemed pretty stark in the early days of ChatGPT's rollout, right, was this idea that that generative AI was sui generis, right? That there's this characteristic of it that has no historical parallel, right? That it is, unique and distinct in its own way, and as a result, that's the sort of thing that gives it its capacity to do something transformative, but also that it makes it hard to predict where it might be going one day, right? So I get that. The thing that I think that sort of analysis, the look at the technical capacities of AI and imagine the possibilities, that sort of way of looking at it, it decontextualizes AI from the larger social system that it's being developed and deployed in, right? And one of the lessons of from folks like Bob McChesney is that you can't understand how these technologies are going to be developed and deployed without making sense of them in the context of capitalism, right?
Mhm.
And that while we might not know what AI is going to be used for, because frankly, the inventors of new technologies themselves don't know what those technologies are going to be used for, right? A couple of of my favorite examples, right? So Edison is at the early days of both recorded sound and recorded film, right?
Mhm.
He thought recorded sound would be used for business dictation, right? That instead of having a secretary write down what a business owner was wanted to do, that the recorded sound would record their ideas. He also thought that movies would be watched one at a time, kind of like a peep show sort of view. Both of those turned out to be quite wrong, right? He did not anticipate the creation of the recording industry, right, as a form of entertainment, right, and he didn't recognize that movies would be watched collectively, right, and so there's this, we're that there's and this is sort of a pattern throughout history, right? And so I think it's hard for us at the moment when technologies are developed to look at their capacities and know what they're going to be used for later on, and as a result, what their social implications are going to be. All right. That said, we do know that under capitalism, right, there are some patterns under which the development of new technologies and the deployment of new technologies tends to unfold, especially when we're talking about communication technologies. All right. Do you mind me sharing another quick
No,
excerpt from
please
a
go
from a
ahead.
book? All right. So one of my other, outside of Bob McChesney's book Digital Disconnect, one of my favorite readings on this sort of stuff is a book called The Master Switch. All right. It's by a writer named Tim Wu. You might be familiar with one of the terms that he coined, which is network neutrality. Right. So he's somebody who knows this landscape of tech. But he also said if you want to understand the internet, we need to look back at how older technologies were introduced to figure out sort of what the patterns are. All right. So, the first thing he says is, when these new technologies come along, there's always this idea that they are going to transform the world for the better. Right. So, he's got a couple examples. He says, thanks to radio, predicted Nikola Tesla, one of the fathers of commercial electricity in 1904, the entire Earth will be converted into a huge brain, as it were, capable of response in every one of its parts. The invention of film, wrote D.W. Griffith in the 1920s, meant that children in public schools will be taught practically everything by moving pictures. Certainly, they will never be obliged to read history again. In 1970, a Sloan Foundation report compared the advent of cable television to that of movable type. The revolution now in sight may be nothing less, and it may be conceivably more. As a character in Tom Stoppard's The Invention of Love, set in 1896, remarks, every age thinks it's the modern age, but this one really is. Right. So there's sort of this idea that, we look at these new technologies when they first roll out as having these grand and oftentimes quite utopian, future trajectories. But then when they actually, hits the grind of of making money, right, which OpenAI, Google, Facebook, etc., are clearly, and Microsoft are clearly oriented to doing, and as people start to take them up, right, that sort of utopian and clear trajectory toward, massive social change runs up against the structures of capitalism, right? It runs up against the actual uses that people put these technologies to, right? And let me just follow up on sort of his take on how things end up eventually going. He says, every few decades, a new communications technology appears, bright with promise and possibility. It inspires a generation to dream of a better society, new forms of expression, alternative types of journalism. Yet each new technology eventually reveals its flaws, kinks, and limitations. For consumers, the technical novelty can wear thin, giving way to various kinds of dissatisfaction with the quality of content, which may trend toward the chaotic and the vulgar, and the reliability or security of service. From industry's perspective, the invention may inspire other dissatisfactions, a threat to revenues of existing information channels that the new technology makes less essential, if not obsolete, a difficulty commoditizing the technology's potential, or too much variation in standards or protocols of use to allow one market a high quality product that will answer the consumer's dissatisfactions. When these problems reach a critical mass and a lost potential for substantial gain is evident, the market's invisible hand waves in some great mogul like Theodore Vail or a band of them who promise a more orderly and efficient regime for the betterment of all users. Usually enlisting the federal government, this kind of mogul is special, for he defines a new type of industry, integrated and centralized. Delivering a better, more secure product, the mogul heralds in a golden age for the life of the new technology. At its heart lies some perfect engine for providing a steady return on capital. In exchange for making the trains run on time, to hazard an extreme comparison, he gains a certain measure of control over the medium's potential for enabling individual expression and technical innovation. Control such as the inventors never dreamed of and necessary to perpetuate itself, as well as the attendant profits of centralization. Right. So there's this idea that we start off with these, utopian, promises of a technology, but then it runs up against sort of, consumer dissatisfaction at a certain point, or it runs up into challenges of how are we going to monetize this, right? How is this going to actually make us as an industry money? And then we see some sort of intervention, right? A model usually facilitated by government intervention that allows for this industry to make money, but in doing so it oftentimes limits the potential range of options for what this technology could do. And I find this to be a really, it's, historically it's been, quite a reliable, even if things have unfolded differently for each technology in different moments, it's been a pretty reliable pattern to make sense of how technologies develop. And I think that while it might be hard to imagine what this particular technology might do because it's sui generis, supposedly, right? It doesn't make sense to disregard the power of capitalism in those moments to shape the trajectory of these technologies.
Agreed, agreed. And I
Yeah.
think in the case of AI, it's more it's definitely there's a economical factor, but there's also additional factor that everyone is talking about right now, which is the safety factor.
Hmm.
Because especially when it comes to democracy, that's when we're talking about technologies that can could generate fake images, it could generate fake information that poses as facts. It can redirect public opinion. It can, using, text, images, and social media together. And so this is more of like not only, the greed of corporation is going to play a factor in its development, but also the safety and what government is going to do about it. Um, so this leads me to the next question: that what do you think, you know, tools like ChatGPT going to do when it comes to critical junctures and their implications on journalism, society, um, and media in general?
Yeah. So I'm glad you mentioned journalism and politics more generally, right? Because when McChesney, so he's a historian, right? But when he looks at critical junctures in communication and media, he says, there's sort of a pattern that critical junctures tend to unfold in moments when three conditions are in place, right? So one big condition is that there's some sort of new communication technology that disrupts the existing system. And I want to come back to that because that's really what your question is about, right? The second condition is that journalism, media, and more specifically journalism, is in a state of disrepute, right? So for example, one of the big critical junctures that created professional journalism as a concept, right? The idea of sort of an objective professional news gatherer and reporter, that hasn't always existed. It was sort of invented in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and the part of the reason it was invented is that journalism was in such crisis. You might have heard of yellow journalism as this period where, of extraordinary sensationalism, beating the drum for the Spanish-American War. Those sorts of contexts tend to lend themselves really well to a critical juncture, not just some sort of new technology, right? But journalism and media being in disrepute. And the third thing he says is that if you've got some sort of larger societal crisis that's unfolding, right? And so when I'm thinking about critical junctures, and I want to get to your question of, what, is this, is this new technology really disruptive to existing industries? I'm also thinking about these journalistic and social crisis dynamics, right? And so I want to come back there, but I want to sort of give that as a broader framework, right? Because he says there's these three conditions. So we want to look at the technology. We also want to look at the information landscape, right? How quality is that information landscape? And what sort of crises are we going through as a society, right? Political, economic, social crises that are contextual.
Mhm.
So, when it comes to sort of the disruptive character of ChatGPT, generative, artificial intelligence, if we just want to focus on that aspect of the wider digital revolution, um, there are certain industries that are clearly right threatened by the development of these technologies. Google issued a code red, right, shortly after the introduction of ChatGPT, and the reason was quite obvious, right? If you can ask ChatGPT a question, right, and it generates an answer for you, right, of greater or lesser quality, what's the value of going to Google, searching, getting a list of links, and then trying to sift through to figure out which one is the best information, quality information, right? So you can understand from Google's perspective, that's terrifying, right? And not shocking that they sort of threw all hands on deck, right? Not that they didn't have, that clearly Google did have artificial intelligence technologies in development, but they needed to launch commercially in response to this. But they also needed to think about how do they launch commercially, right, without undermining their existing business, right? So, and that's a tricky, a tricky thing to figure out. You've got Google launching Bard, for instance, which is their chatbot, right? And more recently, you've got the generative search experience, right? That Google has launched through Google Labs, and I think it's now more widely available. And there we see Google not just providing information like ChatGPT does, right, but also providing links below, right, so you can actually find where the
Which
information came from. Yeah.
nobody clicks, by the way.
Right. Yeah. So, but you can see them sort of trying to navigate this. How do we compete in this marketplace without killing the goose that laid the golden egg, right? Which is search, right? That's where their revenue. That is the heart of their revenue, right? It's the reason they're able to do all the other offerings that Google does, right? Is because of the cash machine that is Google search, right? And so, that's a tricky, tricky thing to walk. It also, I mean, that's an industrial dynamic, but clearly it has implications for how we find and use information, right? These questions about the quality or biases of information coming from ChatGPT and other AI, including generative search experience from Google, those are trade-offs, right? Because there are other, valuable and challenging ways of finding information in the old Google search model, and that's going to have implications for how we navigate day-to-day life, right? So this transition isn't just a transition for Google; it's a transition for all of us right now, in figuring out how we answer questions and do work, life, school activities, in an information context.
Yeah, I mean, it's like back in the days, you want to search for information, you go to a physical library and you look at the glossary and the index of all of the books, and then you climb the ladders and collect a book and open to it, and then Google came and say, you know what, just type your query, and then I'll show you where the books are,
Mhm.
basically. And now all of a sudden we have, you know what, you don't need to enter the physical library, this whole library. We're gonna bring a librarian who's a genius and who can read all of the books in the library, and you just ask the librarian. And basically that's what's happening right now. So if I can just go and ask the librarian for the information, why do I need to sort through all the books?
Yeah.
So do
So
you do you believe that the search is over, like that is this the death of search engines?
yeah, I don't know if it's the death of search engines, in part because I don't know the future of AI, right? And AGI. There's this tendency to assume that these things will sort of march on in this, unimpeded way. There are questions about whether there are limits that these systems will hit in terms of their capacity to expand as quickly as they have in their power. There's also the question of broader societal impositions, right? Whether there is regulation, right? Whether consumers like the experience or not. Or whether they use it for different things. And there's, a question of whether these companies are able to make money in the marketplace, right? Which will, very much determine the trajectory of these technologies in this industry, right? And so that's and one of the biggest. Sorry, Jennifer just asked a question about copyright, which is right in this wheelhouse here. So Jennifer is also my wife, full disclosure. But the question about copyright is really important because these systems depend on text and images that have been gathered from across the web, scraped from across the web, right, without the permission of the people who produced them, right, by and large. And so, one of the big questions right now is the legality, the very legality of these systems themselves, right? There's a group of artists that have sued Midjourney and Stable Diffusion, and they're saying, hey, look, you have taken our images, basically remixed them, right? And now these things are being monetized, right? Without us, without, first of all, compensation, but maybe even more importantly, without asking, right? And this is going to be a big question. There was a Supreme Court case a couple weeks ago that looked at, a piece of a piece of art that sorry, I'm just blanking on the artist, which is embarrassing. If you give me just a moment. Um,
No worries. In the meantime, I just want to say I'm so sorry. I forgot to acknowledge our live audience, and I just realized that there's a ton of questions in the chat. And what I'm going to try to do is, by the end of this, we can just go through the questions probably, or as we find a minute. And thank you all for watching.
Yeah. So thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to digging into those questions. So the court case was looking at, I was blanking, but the court case was looking at a piece of art by Andy Warhol. and it was an image of Prince. And the question was whether the Andy Warhol Foundation, right, who currently has the ownership of Warhol's works, right, whether they could go ahead and market one of those works that had an image of Prince without compensating the original photographer who had taken the picture. Right. So, if we're thinking about a piece of Andy Warhol's work, right, he's playing with the color, playing with saturation of other people's photography. Right. And, the court said, no, the original artist, right, the person who created this image, has the copyright on it, and that the Warhol estate shouldn't be able to just and I'm sorry, I'm not a copyright lawyer. We're covering a wide range of topics here, but that the Warhol estate doesn't have the ability to just go ahead and reuse that over and over again without compensating or getting permission from the original photographer, right? And this has started to become a case that might have implications for AI, right? You've got Google, you've got Facebook, you've got OpenAI, right, who are using words, using images from other folks, right? Not compensating them, not acknowledging them for their work, right? And then remixing it, right? Much as Warhol remixed, right? And commercially marketing those, right? And OpenAI, what they say is that this is covered under fair use, the fair use provision of copyright. And they say, look, we're involved in a transformative use of technology to transform the meaning of these words and images, right? But what the court said is that fair use is a balancing act, right? There is, consideration of whether the communication is transformative, but there's also a question of whether it's done commercially, right? And whether it impedes with the market of other, of the original artists, of the other original creators, right? And so you've got these folks suing, Midjourney, suing Stable Diffusion, saying, hey, it's hard for me to make a living now because you've remixed artists like mine's work, right? And you've monetized that in a way that allows people to get work like ours for free, right? And this is going to be a really interesting, question. And it's sort of an example of how, the structures of capitalism, including copyright law, right, end up being dynamics that if you just look at the technology, right, you think this will, march forward in this sort of unimpeded path, right? But we might have law here, right? And we might have, really important law, right, which is whether folks are compensated for the creative work that they've done, potentially creating impediments for this industry's development as its creators would like it to develop, right? Or as these companies would like it to develop, right? So, I think these are things for us to sort of keep in mind when it comes to whether or not this is a well, I think it is a critical juncture, but the question of how that critical juncture would play out is very much contingent, right? Very much still up in the air at this moment.
I know we're a little bit diverting from like the structure of the talk. However, it's very interesting, and I believe it's very related to our topic. What we're talking about, the copyright, and I second your opinion. Like, what's the incentive for me, let's say, to start a blog? If generative AI, anybody who can, if I don't have ads from views, if I don't have search engine marketing associated, like AdWords and stuff like that associated with my blog that generates me money, then what's the incentive? If people are not, for example, this podcast, if people are not seeking a podcast to learn about something and instead going directly to ChatGPT, what's the incentive of actually spending this time talking? So I think this is a really important. And worse is that all of these talks that we're talking right now will be scripted and then will be fed into the next generation AI, that it will conclude everything, the information, the ideas we were just suggesting. It will swallow them, and then someone in 2025 will be searching for an information, and it will spit out the idea that you suggested in this talk without giving you any credit.
And consider this, right? The existing model, right? Consider like the Google search model, right? It's not perfect, right? It has, been pointed at as as one of the contributors to the downfall of journalism, right? Because people can go to Google, and for a little while, at least, they were able to get a snippet of news stories without actually going to the news itself, right? But at the same time, there was the link. Right, there was the availability to use Google to get to the news, and in fact, Google search, for all of the sort of advertising revenue that Google took from news organizations and Facebook took from news organizations, for all of that sort of loss of revenue, Google search and Facebook, social media posts are some of the most important places that people find news, right? If you turn to chat gpt, now first of all, chat gpt has a limitation in that it's not producing output that is current, right, in terms of stuff that happened today. But I see no reason that they're not going to go there, right? And that
It's
Google's not
there.
going.
It's
Yeah.
there with GPT-4.
Yeah.
If you connect, if you're having like an advanced account and
Yeah.
you connect internet, it's
Yeah.
possible. But
So
yeah,
we're clearly headed there. But if those sources become the end, of where you go for news, rather than the beginning of where you go for news, where you go for information, where you go for entertainment, podcasts like this, right, which are both, I hope, not just informative but also entertaining, right? If those be if the if something like generative search experience or GPT become the end of the path, right, of the information or entertainment seeker, rather than the beginning of it, right, then that's a real problem for the larger information ecosystem, right? It's not so different from Wikipedia, right? So I tell my students all the time, you're writing a paper, Wikipedia is a great place to start your research and a terrible place to end it, right? It's much like Google search. It is a pathway to information, and all these pathways have pluses and minuses. Clearly, Google has limitations in terms of what it exposes us to and what gets pushed down in its search results. But at the end of the day, it does connect us with information rather than summarizing that information and cutting out the source, right? Which I think is a troubling implication of what's being developed right now.
yeah, and it looks like we're heading this way. And I wouldn't be surprised if I can see ChatGPT or similar servers that provides, for example, optional. Like for example, you ask a question and then you tell it, I want the output to be in a video format or in a
Mhm.
podcast format. I'm driving for 2 hours. Give me information about critical junctures, and it will generate the content, transform it into audio, put it on your machine. And again, what's the incentive of us doing this? What's the incentive of all the publications, all the journalists? When they're going to make money?
Yeah.
When they're going to make any sort of not only money, but also, do we have value as a human beings anymore? Like, it's really going beyond just economical, but more of, is our work has any meaning?
Yeah. So yeah, and it's yeah. So no, I'm right there with you. And the question about work and meaning, there's clearly the potential, right, for this to undermine labor markets, right? I know that there's the competing argument that says, hey, these new technologies historically have tended to create just as many new jobs as they've undermined, right? And I think you had an earlier episode that focused a lot around those issues. And there are people who I students I talk to in class, and you see this sort of discourse that, well, when I see ChatGPT's output, right, it's not as good as me, right, writing my best writing, right, or me producing my best, video or photography, whatever it might happen to be. And I get that, but I also think it's a little misguided in assuming that the companies that employ people, whether it's a news organization, right, whether it's a university, right, employing instructors, right, whatever the context happens to be, I think it would be wrong to assume that the top priority of those entities, especially the for-profit ones, that the top priority is the quality of the thing that's produced, right? They care about the quality of the thing that's produced because they need to have consumers, right? But they also care about the cost efficiency of production, right? And so if you can, all other things being equal, right, produce as many readers, right, or viewers, if you're a media outlet, for instance, with AI output, right? And you're able to do so at a much cheaper cost, right? Using labor, if we want to call it that, right? That doesn't get sick, right? That doesn't complain, that doesn't unionize, right? Those are things that any organization, right, that is profit oriented is going to be excited about, not just to cut costs, but also as a form of labor discipline, right? The remaining folks that are working there at that organization, if you know that this tech is breathing down your neck, right? Or even if you think that the folks who are running your organization would at least experiment with it, right? To see how it goes, kind of like CNET, right? So CNET, the tech reporting, outfit, they, in I think December started, they produced, I think, like 75 AI written articles. They weren't great. They made mistakes too, right? But they were willing to experiment with it, right? And that sort of, to me, that illustrates where we're going to see this sort of, it's going to be called innovation, right? But it's going to look very different for the folks that are working in those contexts on the labor side of things, right? And the very threat of it, right, is a form of labor discipline, right? That can keep folks in line, and it really runs the risk of sort of tipping the balance of that labor capital relationship.
Absolutely. Before going to the final remarks, I want to divert into democracy and politics a little bit. I know, I don't know how far we can go when it
Yeah.
comes to politics, but I noticed that when it comes to cable, especially in American politics, and I just came to the U.S. I'm by far very little knowledgeable about the American politics. But what I easily can see is that you've got networks that belong to one side of the story, and there's like another network to belong, and it's clearly a propaganda machine on each side. But when it comes to, like, we see recently, like Tucker Carlson moved from Fox News to Twitter, and he says, you know what? Enough with all these network news. I'm just going to build my Twitter empire and have an independent voice that I can say whatever I want and be neutral. What do you see of this development in terms of media that's impacting, of course, voters in the end of the day?
Yeah. Well, I would push back a little bit on that characterization of Tucker first. Tucker, the lawsuit that led to Tucker's dismissal from Fox News made it quite clear that he knew that he was lying to his viewers about.
Obviously, I don't know about
No,
the
no, no,
full.
it's all right. He knew he was lying to his viewers
Mhm.
about the election, about the claims that it had been stolen. His text messages show that he knew that, right? But he did it in part because it was good for business, right? And I think the common thread there between all of those cable networks, right, is that the underlying bias is not the party that they're most closely associated with, content wise, but that they are all commercial operations, right, and that they have the inherent biases of commercial media, that they are inclined towards sensationalism, right, to get the largest audience possible. They're inclined toward giving that audience what it wants to hear as well, because doing so creates these really sort of niche demographics, right? All the conservatives are here, all the liberals over here, and it makes them feel good about themselves, and that's a good situation for advertisers to insert their content in, right? And so when I look at the cable landscape specifically, it's clearly, we can look and see this sort of political bias, but there's an underlying commercial bias that is problematic across the cable news landscape, right? In terms of democracy, right? That dynamic that you talked about there is often cited as a contributor toward polarization, right? And if we, 20 years ago, if you asked folks, what they thought about, a handful of issues, Democrats and Republicans at the median of those different parties, they'd have pretty similar viewpoints. Actually, the Pew Research Center has done sort of historical research, asking the same questions over time. 1994. Folks were answering, 20 big questions about politics roughly the same way, the median Democrat and the median Republican. You get to 2008, post 2008, and certainly 2016 or so, and you've got this real bifurcation, right, where the ideas that that liberal-leaning Democrats have and the ideas that conservative Republicans have are they're so wide apart, right? And so we get this sort of attention to polarization as sort of a characterization of our contemporary political moment. That said, I think it's worth highlighting, right, that one of those parties is espousing ideas, right, that if we look through sort of a checklist of what are the ideas that are most closely associated with fascism, right, a strong man who perpetuates a myth that and is dismissive of democratic norms and institutions and the rule of law, right? The demonization of women and minorities, right? The crafting of a national myth around racial superiority, right? Those are all sort of characteristics of the rise of fascism, something that we've seen, historically over and over again, especially in moments of sort of economic pain, right? Economic crisis. The reason I mention this is that one of the characteristics, though, of sort of the rise of fascism is a dismissal of the idea of truth, right? A dismissal of the idea that we can agree about certain basic facts and have a debate about what should be done as a result, right? And the reason that sort of the post-truth idea is so important in the rise of fascism, and I would argue what's happening right now, right, is that if you're a politician who can get their base, right, to dispense with the idea of truth, right, and to invest instead of the myth and the strongman, right, you've got the potential then to tell them, for instance, at the moment of an election, that the results aren't real, right, that this is not in fact what happened. I won, and you should go ahead and take the action you think is appropriate to realize that myth I've been telling, right? To put me as the strong man in a position where I can right these wrongs, right? Where I can do justice. I think one of the more disturbing things we've seen in recent weeks is former President Trump saying that if he were elected, he would have the Justice Department go and use its power, right, to take down his political enemies, right? Rather than the Justice Department operating independently, it would operate at the will of the chief executive, right? And those are the sorts of things, right, that should make us really, in the context of critical junctures, right? Critical junctures happen when there's some sort of new communication technology, right? When journalism is in disrepute, and when there's some sort of socio-political crisis, right? And I would argue that it's not just, right? It's not just polarization, right? But it's also the rise of new political forms that are part of this crisis.
But what do you think about, when the media, of course, we're talking about the typical cable news, but then in the let's say in the recent years, social media was also playing along. Like you from the Twitter files and whatnot, then we could notice that the major social media channels were having a deep interference from politicians into their censorship and shadow banning stuff, and it's only recently came up. And what do you think of like Twitter's mission to say, you know what, enough is enough. We're gonna go back to freedom of speech and absolutism of freedom of speech. And I'm not here by any chance like trying to like be on a side of any of them. Again, I'm very neutral and I don't know a lot about politics, but I think it's interesting to see how the digital transformation of media is also being impacted by industrialism and capitalism. And also, I want you also to touch on AI's role in the future for that ecosystem.
Yeah. So, when it comes to Twitter specifically, right? We've seen clearly Elon Musk take a different tack, right, with Twitter. We've also seen Twitter users respond with their feet, right, and say that the Twitter that he has created, which you've characterized as sort of, free, free and independent, it's also creating a context where people don't want to be, right, and so every commercial media organization has to balance, especially when we're talking about the internet, right? They engage in a practice of balancing this sort of freedom and flexibility, right, with creating an environment where people actually want to be and can learn and can interact with each other in a way that they find productive. And people have responded with their feet and said, "This is not the place I want to be," right? Um, when it comes to the media landscape, I think there's a lot of focus clearly on cable news and on social media, and those are, undoubtedly super important, right? To me, when I'm thinking about McChesney's framework, right? He really singles out journalism and says you got to pay attention to journalism during critical junctures, right? And I think the rationale is that historically journalism has been the way that we make sense of the world unfolding around us, right? And if you have a corrupt, an ineffective, a sensationalist journalism, right? That's not going to help folks make sense of what's unfolding technologically, politically in an effective way. And it can make those crises worse. Right. And so, I'm really interested, as much as social media and cable news are an important part of the media ecosystem, and cable news has a quasi journalistic dimension to it. I'm really interested in news gathering and reporting, right? And the extent to which that is a vibrant ecosystem. And right now, it's in a really sad state. Right now, if I ask, if I do this in class, I tell my students, all right, if I told you there was a crisis in journalism, what would you say that crisis is, right? And so much of it is fake news, right? Misinformation, disinformation, and that's true, right? That's clearly an important part of it. I was looking at some data recently that in the late 1970s, more than 70% of folks trusted the mass media, right? And you might say that that's troubling in and of itself, right? But it was the character. People turned to it as an institution where they could get information that they trusted. That number's down to the low 30s today, right? And part of it is clearly attacks on the press as the enemy of the people, right? We've got the press attacking itself, right? For instance, Fox News characterizing the rest of the media landscape as this a bunch of liberal stooges, even though those entities are run by the biggest Fortune 500 companies, right? Which sort of is an odd juxtaposition. But when we're thinking about that stuff, that's all well and good, right? But we also have to ask, does journalism actually have the resources to do its job, right? And what we've seen since about 2000 is that the news landscape, specifically newspapers, and most of the original news that is produced and circulated in the US today still starts with newspapers, right? It doesn't start, with, the cable news talking heads, right? Or somebody on social media sharing a link that's some sort of original content. Most news, right, that is actually, substantive journalism still starts with newspapers, right? The trouble is the newspaper industry has lost about 80% of its revenue, inflation adjusted, since 2000, right? Some of that's pretty obvious why, right? You've had readers and advertisers that have gone to the web, right? You've had Facebook and Google capture an enormous, portion of the advertising revenue, which was the historically, the base of the industry, right? And the consequences from that, as well as hedge funds coming in and buying up newspapers across the U.S. Here in the Inland Empire of California, where I live, the four major daily newspapers in the area are all owned by the same hedge fund, and what they've done is just concentrated it into one news gathering outfit, right? And at all four newspapers, they produce the exact same news with just a different name of the newspaper, right? Just a decimation of the news gathering infrastructure in one of the fastest growing areas in the country, right? And so, in that context, we've got this hollowing out of journalism where more than a quarter of newspapers have closed across the country, right? That's both their print version as well as their online version. And you've got more than half of newspaper journalists laid off since 2004, right? And almost a quarter of journalists across the whole ecosystem gone, right? So that there's this sort of twin dynamic here, right? Where on the one hand, you've got this rise of misinformation, right? You've got this rise of fake news, but you've also, or at least claims of fake news, right? Because it's not always fake. Sometimes it's just inconvenient news that people would like to classify as fake, right? But you've also got a hollowing out of the journalistic infrastructure that's been there traditionally to make sense of the world around us, right? And those two things together have been characterized, Victor Piccard calls it a misinformation society, right? That dropping out of the financial basis for journalism, while at the same time, this sort of explosion of online misinformation and disinformation, right? And so, when we're thinking about this framework of critical junctures, you got the transformative, technology, right? You've got the, political crisis. And I can tell we've got some folks who don't agree with my characterization of the political crisis. But even if you don't agree with mine, I bet they think that there's a political crisis themselves that they see, right? And third, you've clearly got a troubled information landscape, right? Hollowing out of journalism, explosion of misinformation, and you've got sensational talking heads on cable news sort of making sense of it all, right? And that's the recipe for the sort of crisis that we're interpreting AI within, right? And deciding how to move forward with this new communication technology, right? That itself has some troubling dynamics and some promising dynamics.
Before going to the questions, I know we're taking a little bit longer than, but it's very interesting. I mean, for me, like I'm learning a lot, and yeah, I mean, I really appreciate your time. But before going to the questions, as a conclusion or a final takeaways, I feel that we have described the problem. We have displayed what are the problems are without offering any solution. So as you're doing your concluding notes, could you please also offer like a glimpse of hope maybe for a better future? I'm an optimist by myself, so I hope that we can figure out a way to fix things.
Yeah. So, I think the concept of critical junctures, it can be sort of this troubling, analysis, right? But it also has sort of baked into it this hope, right? This optimism. And the optimism stems from the fact that no media or communication system is natural. Right? The commercial broadcasting system was not natural. Professional journalism was not natural, right? The First Amendment was not natural. These are creations of human systems, right? And those human systems can create new communication and media arrangements as well. Right. And so, I think the first thing to sort of recognize is that, right? The second is to study the history, right? To look at the patterns of how these things have historically evolved, right? And to say, okay, I recognize here that there is this utopian, vision, right? And that there may very well be some really positive, outcomes of these technologies, right? But I also know historically that when these systems hit a moment of crisis, right, there is oftentimes some sort of coordination, right, between industry and government, right, to create a stable information environment, right, that is also quite monopolistic, right, that also lends itself to commercialism, right? And the trick is, in terms of, promoting pro-social democratic values, right? And I say democratic in the small d democratic, not the Democratic Party, right? The trick is to figure out how do everyday folks, right, coordinate in a way that gives them an ability to have a seat at the table, right, for the development of these technologies at the moments when these critical junctures unfold, right? Because if you're OpenAI and you are Google and you are Facebook and Microsoft, you want to be the folks sitting in front of Congress, right? Even though they seem like they're in the hot seat, right? You want to be the ones framing the conversation, right? You want to be the ones focusing on future risks, right? Rather than current risks, right? You want to be the ones talking about all the jobs that will be created rather than, which jobs will be erased or which jobs will be made, really ugly, right? I was reading an article the other day about this work called of what are called taskers, right? These are these folks who are sort of annotate images and text and say, this is a shirt, this is a nice statement, etc. And there's, we think that AI is this, specifically just servers operating, right, but there are people who are there as well doing a lot of the work of making these models effective and useful, right, and that work is pretty ugly. Right, it is work that is mundane, it is work that is alienating. You have to do it in isolation, not talk to anybody about it because it's super secret what models you might be working on, right, and it tends to be quite low paid, right? And so, those are the sorts of conversations that, Sam Altman, right, and Sundar Pichai, they don't want to be having about these technologies and their development, right? What they would prefer to do is be the ones that Congress is turning to for consultation, right? And we see this, already. The Congress, sorry, Harry Schumer the other day said that they were setting up a framework for how would we would develop regulation around AI, right? But the framework said we need to educate ourselves as Congress, right? Because we've looked really stupid, frankly, in the past when we've tried to regulate social media, for instance, which they never actually did, right? We need to, we need to be better informed when we go into this process with respect to AI, and we need to be educated, right? Who's going to be the ones educating them, right? That's a huge question, right? And it can't just be because they say it's so complex, right? It can't just be the folks at OpenAI, Google, Facebook, et cetera, right? It's got to be both a Washington and grassroots, right, collaboration. It's got to be broad based, right? It can't just be from folks who look like me, right, deciding what these technologies are going to be used for and what sort of guardrails need to be placed on them, what sort of areas of social life, childhood for instance, we might not want to have AI to have such a dominant presence in, right? And so these are the things that people can and should, in my opinion, get involved in, right? My sort of introduction to this whole area was around 2005, right? And in 2005, the FCC was considering rolling back some of its last ownership limits on newspapers and television stations at the time, right? And what they did was they went out and did sort of a listening tour, right? And it was, for a regulatory agency, a pretty democratic process. I went to a forum in St. Pete where folks shared their concerns, right, about media consolidation, right, about cross ownership between newspapers and television stations. They had, everybody from me as a student at the time to farm workers in Immokalee, Florida, right, and they were saying, look, we are opposed to this, this concentration of media. We think, in fact, that we should be looking toward low power FM stations, right, that allow individual neighborhoods to broadcast to their communities, right? And the consequence of this, when millions of people showed up to say no, please don't do further consolidation was they stopped, right? At least for that moment. And it's just a small case, right? It's not, the grand sweep of things has been more and more, right, toward corporate consolidation and dominance of the regulatory process. But there are things that people can, everyday folks, when they work together, can go and have, make significant accomplishments if you have a broad-based movement, right? If Congress is not exclusively listening to Facebook and Google and Amazon, keep in mind, Facebook and Amazon in 2001 were the two top contributors in terms of lobbying, right, on Capitol Hill, right? More than aerospace, right? More than defense contractors, more than agribusiness and pharmaceuticals, right? This is not some pushover industry, right? By any means, and they're going to do everything they can to turn this artificial intelligence into something that's profitable for them. And what's profitable for them may not be positive for everybody else, right? And that's the tension that everyday folks need to get involved in, because there isn't a seat at the table, right, if you don't coordinate and act together as a group. Yeah.
I'm so delighted that you mentioned that. I'm so delighted that you said, or you're asking people to get involved. It's a huge alignment on our vision together. Like when I started Singularity Syndicate, it was the whole idea was coming together as a group. And I'm very happy to announce that Singularity Syndicate is approaching 700 members. And if you're watching right now, whether the recording on YouTube or whether live, I want to really thank you for watching and continue to listening. 1 hour and 15 minutes. This means a lot to us. But also, if you're watching this long, I think you shouldn't miss the opportunity to be among the members and to join the meetup group. The website Singularity Syndicate down there will take you to a website where you will find the link for the meetup group. And I really appreciate you joining. And also, if you can support the channel by subscribing, that would be to the YouTube channel, or that would be great. Are we ready for some questions, Doctor? And if you can, please, as minimum as possible, because we're really short on time right now. So let's go. So the first, okay, I'm just gonna display the questions on the screen, and you could. So I think that the ones that you already answered, for example, Diana, my partner, says that is radio a critical juncture?
Historically, radio is absolutely a critical juncture. I mean, when you think about in terms of, first of all, sort of the consolidation of monopoly capitalism, right? It was something that, if you were a goods or consumer, or a goods or services producer in the early 1900s, one of the questions was, how are you going to get people to buy this stuff? Right? And radio was one solution that was developed. That commercial model of supporting media with advertising was one of the ways that capitalism kept churning, right, for better or for worse, right? And additionally, it also sort of created a wider sense of nation, right? In the pre-radio era, media was consumed in a much more local context, right? You had local newspapers, et cetera, but radio really created the sense of a national audience and increasingly a national identity, right? And so I think there are lots of ways in terms of economics, politics, culture, et cetera, that being able to hear voices over the radio. One of my favorites, right, is that radio changed people's living rooms, right? People organized their living rooms around a radio set, some of which were beautiful and ordained, right? Ornate, sorry. And in doing so, right, was passed on later with television, right? In terms of how we organize not just our time, but our space, right? In our lived experience. And so, yeah, absolutely. Radio, undoubtedly a critical juncture.
Cool. H.M. Walsh says, how can human writers, artists, photographers compete with the faster ChatGPT and DALI The elite companies will save money by creating faster, more efficient, non-unionized humanoids, for example.
Yeah, so I'm of two minds on this, right? One of me, the sort of the business side of me says, yeah, these companies are going to be doing everything they can to tap into these tools to lower their labor costs, right? This is what Sam Altman refers to as Moore's law for everything, that the cost of labor is just going to fall across the board, right? On the other hand, I am not sold in my own use of ChatGPT and other, generative AI tools. I write with Notion a lot, which I know, Naja, that's, a tool that you use. And I have the AI that's built into Notion, which is made by Anthropic. And so my experience with it, I think at first I was really trying to use it and see what would, see how it works, see what kind of benefits it has. But I found that my experience was I was rewriting a lot of what ChatGPT, or sorry, in that case, Anthropic was providing for me through Notion, right? And I just am not, at least in the early iterations here, I'm not sold on the idea that it is going to displace writing because writing seems to be something that it is both good at and terribly derivative in the things that it produces, right? And good writing is oftentimes something that takes a little bit more savvy and creativity, right? And anybody who has edited knows that, and this was actually discussed at length on the podcast. Sorry, Citations Needed, which is a terrific podcast. But they were saying, look, anybody who's edited knows that rewriting bad writing is so much takes so much more time than writing well the first time. Right? So maybe these tools end up getting better at their writing, but I'm also sort of sitting there saying, in their current iteration, they're also adding more time to the things that we're doing.
I agree, and I think this gives rise to stuff like prompt engineering,
Mhm.
because I also experience that a lot. Like if you just ask very cliche questions, you will get cliche answers that really wouldn't serve you any good. But if you work, I mean, I use GPT-4 and I love the reasoning, and I work with the logical progression of the prompts to arrive at what's in my head, but improved and amplified by ChatGPT. So
Yep.
that's how my use case.
Yeah. I do want to just mention, I think, as we see companies start to experiment with this, whether or not you are in in a workplace that has a collective bargaining agreement is going to be an important question, right? Or whether you are negotiating these things individually, right, as an individual worker, is going to be a big, determinant as to whether you are protected against these sorts of these sorts of efforts. In the media landscape, we've seen a big boom over the past couple of years in unionization. Um, you know, uh, Plenty of especially digital media outlets that have unionized, in part because their working conditions with the crisis in journalism have eroded so terribly. Right? And that those sort of spaces to negotiate collectively are going to be a really important uh, y- you know tool, right, arrangement for pushing back against just cost cutting efforts by employers.
Yeah, that's great. I think this is also another question from Diana, which touched upon AGI. So, do you think, as you're saying that you're not happy with the output of Notion's AI, do you think AGI is going to be? First of all, do you think AGI is happening? Is it reality, or is it just a fake concept for
Yeah.
now?
So, I think when it comes to, I want to mention, I'm not saying that Notion's AI is necessarily bad. I'm just saying it's not great for writing, right? At least in my opinion, or at least it's not great for creating its own writing, right? And you need to be there sort of at every step along the way to make sure what it creates is of significant value. When it comes to AI and AGI, right? I think part of this comes down to questions of semantics, right? In terms of what is intelligence, what is general intelligence. But the as I understand the vision of AGI, right, it's sort of the capacity to create a single model, right, that could do all the things the human mind could do across every imaginable context, right? And I think for a while the assumption was, that's just not going to be a thing that necessarily happens, because we're going to have the training of smaller models, right, that are more specialized for this task or that task, right? So when it comes to, putting together legal, documents, there might be a particular model that is, that's best for that, right? And I think the surprising thing with ChatGPT was just how useful it was at doing a whole range, right, of things, right? When it comes to whether that it, you know so that seems to be general in the sense of, working across multiple contexts, right? Being able to produce some writing, they're creating images, they're coding, producing code, right? So there's there's this ability to work across different contexts, right? But then there's the question of whether it's doing reasoning, right? That or whether it will be doing reasoning that is comparable to what the human mind does, right? And there we run into questions of what what the human mind is actually doing, right? Noam Chomsky's got this piece that was, I think, in the New York Times, where he says, this is, this is predicting the next word, and that's not what the human mind does. It is inductive reasoning, right, in terms of making conclusions based on a large set of data, right, about what the next thing might be. And Chomsky's argument is that human reasoning is more about causes and effects, right, and being able to make predictions not on a quantitative basis but on a qualitative basis, and that ChatGPT doesn't have that qualitative experience with the world in order to make those sorts of conclusions, right? And I don't know. This is not my area of expertise, and so I would generally sort of defer to folks who study intelligence in that way to make sense of it, which I know is something that you're particularly interested in, Naja.
Yeah, I just finished a book called The Fourth Age, and he says the author says exactly kind of similar what you're saying, is that it really depends on the belief.
Mhm.
If you believe that humans are purely a machine, then yes, we can form a synthetic machine. And if you believe that humans are more than just a machine, then also you're true either or. It just depends on what's your inner belief system, which I find really interesting.
Yeah.
But of course, this topic is different
Yeah.
for another.
One thing, though, to get back to the question of sort of economics, though, and how that impacts this stuff. So the the thing that I find really interesting about ChatGPT being able to do such a wide range of tasks, right? The thing that's interesting there is that if you don't need smaller models for every different thing you want to accomplish, right? Or if you can have a chat GPT, API output, right, that is tailored to a particular set of tasks, right? Then that puts a whole lot of power in a handful of large language models, right?
Mm,
And all of a sudden, who runs those large language models is sort of one place that our mind goes, right? The other thing that really matters, though, is what is their business model, right? If we're talking about something like, Google, right? Their business model, at least historically, has been exposing us to advertising based on what they know about our previous click searches and purchases, right? Are they going to be in a position with the, with the uh, AI that they're producing, whether it's Bard, whether it's search generative experience, are they going to start integrating that logic into those AI? Right? Are we going to have ads that are surreptitiously served to us in our content, right? That we get from that AI? Are they going to tailor that AI not just based on the subject matter, but based on what they know about us, about our worldviews, about our
wow.
beliefs, right? If that ends up happening, then I'm not sure this looks a whole lot different from the echo chambers on social media.
Yeah.
right? Because
Yep.
that's what the echo chambers on social media do, right? They give us content based on what they know we are already interested in, or that will, get our blood pressure up, right? Because that's the sort of stuff that keeps us on the platform, right? That keeps us clicking and keeps us seeing ads, right? And so, one thing that I'm thinking about in terms of this sort of the ability to work across multiple different contexts is that it seems to concentrate power in the hands of just a few companies that have the largest language models, that have the most data, right?
Mhm.
And in doing so, anytime you've got a concentration of communication power in society, that's a risk, right? But there's also the question of what's their business model and what sorts of things does it do to the communication environment, to the media environment.
Absolutely. We have Cheyenne Rouhani asking, I don't know too much about AI. What are the best resources to use to learn more about it? Is it through learning machine learning, reading AI books, articles, etc.? If you want, if you don't mind, I can jump in here, and
Go for it.
because this is exactly, I approached. My story is that I was passionate about AI way before ChatGPT came. I'm very spiritual about it. I was thinking, oh, imagine we have the internet and we have a collective brain and stuff like that. So I was curious back like 5, 6 years ago, and I started with AI books. I think the AI books allowed me to see a different future. And then, I decided to enroll in a master's in information system just to be hands on more in the technical part. But I think it depends what you want to do with that information. If you want to be in the development of AI, if you want to be um, contribute, like being employed or building yourself an AI model, then yes, you need to go into the technical route. But if you're like me, I'm more interested in the philosophical aspects, in the side of things. So I want to understand the technology on a deeper level. So yes, therefore I have some hands-on experience when it comes to technology, but I'm also interested in tying it back to humanity and what we can do with it and what the implications are. And basically, that's my route. What do you think, Doctor?
Yeah, so I'm a big podcast listener, and so I'm gonna drop a couple recommendations for podcasts that I think they're doing a good job. Not all perfectly, and I think some have some troubling biases in the way, but they're sort of a good way to sort of keep up with big ideas and what's unfolding in the area. One is the Ezra Klein Show, right? So Ezra is a really popular podcaster, opinion writer for the New York Times. He has on really big, thinkers and creators from AI. Sam Altman was, one of his guests, and he, goes through a series of, I think, pretty for someone from a legacy news organization. He's asking what I think are pretty good and sometimes tough questions of the folks in that space. Another is the podcast Hard Fork. So Hard Fork has there's Casey Newton, who is the writer for the newsletter Platformer, and I'm blanking on the name of the other host, but Casey Newton, especially his Platformer newsletter, is uh, a great weekly. Actually, I think he publishes a couple times a week. Look at the tech industry with a lot of focus lately on AI, and also he's really good about working in questions of democracy into the conversation in terms of what are the implications here of these tools and technologies for our ability to self-govern, right? There was a really I think valuable but quite critical take on AI podcast recently from Citations Needed, which is a great podcast on PR. And basically, what they do in that one is sort of look at what is the narrative around AI coming out of the heights of the industry, especially sort of these utopian on the one hand, doomer sort of conclusions on the other. And they argue that both of those sort of serve the AI industry's interests in suggesting that these tools have a sort of an inevitable march to power, right? Which takes then the power away from us as users, as citizens, over questions of what do we want to use this thing for, right? And the other thing that it's the other thing that it does is it shifts attention away from current harms, right? The current things that AI and predictive analytics, because we've been talking a lot about generative AI, but predictive analytics is part of AI as well. And when it comes to predictive analytics, especially, I love the movie Coded Bias, right, which is a great exploration of the implications of predictive analytics and as well as generative AI for poor and marginalized communities, and how these technologies are built on data sets that are not themselves neutral and then end up reproducing inequalities in the world through the technology.
Yeah, totally. I think that's a wrap. I think one more, if possible. I was in Mid AI Summit San Diego earlier this month, and there's a lot of concern about privacy and validation. I think what area do you think AI will have the most impact? Probably this would be our last question, if you may answer before concluding.
So privacy, and when you're talking about when you're talking about validation, are we talking about whether are we talking about the extent to which we can know the basis of any particular output? Because I don't know that I've heard the term used in quite that way. And Naja, I don't know if you're able to help me out.
Um, I think the question is, what areas do you think AI will have the
Okay.
most impact
Yeah.
on?
So
So what life changes is going to happen?
what life changes? I mean, I think, I mean, I focused a lot on work here already.
Mhm.
Some of the most interesting questions I think that Ezra Klein raises in his podcast is what this is going to do to relationships. Right. It might seem quite novel now, but he raises the potential of sort of AI friends and companions, right, being a thing that might roll out for companionship, for instance, for the elderly, right? But there's my kids ask a lot of questions of Alexa at home, right? And it almost starts to look a little bit like a parasocial relationship, right? A friendship. And to the extent that these start to or continue to seem quite convincing as substitutes for human communication and quote unquote intelligence, right? I think that's a big social dynamic that it will be interesting to explore. Is what this means for interpersonal relationships, not just larger societal relationships between citizens and governments, citizens and companies, and companies and their employees, but also how people interact with their friends and family.
Absolutely. To different degrees of intensity, I think AI is going to impact everything. And
Yeah,
that's my personal view. Uh, in all aspects of life, I
yeah,
think it's strongly going to have presence, and in a lot of areas, it's going to have a transformative nature.
yeah.
Um, that was an amazing um, 1 hour and 40 minutes now. I want to thank you deeply, Doctor, for all what you said, and for taking stage with me here.
Thank
And
you for the time. It was a lot of fun to bounce these ideas off you.
absolutely, it was a pleasure. I'm gonna put on screen for people to contact you. They can reach you via this email. For the audience, thank you a lot for interacting with us. Thank you for listening. And yeah, if you have any further comment, just you can drop it in the comments section. And Until next episode, thank you very much.
Thank you.